If you do the crime, do the time, goes the saying. When being sentenced to lengthy prison sentences, most prisoners don't expect to live long enough to ever be free again. However, some people have defied the odds and outlived ridiculously long prison sentences. Today, we are going to be looking at 10 people who outlived insanely long prison sentences. Before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss a video. Let's jump right in. Number 10. Eddie Collins. Collins served a 43-year sentence on a first-degree murder charge. He was 21 years old when his life was changed forever. He was buying drugs with his 17-year-old brother, Johnny, in a bad part of the city. The two brothers and the man they were getting the drugs from got into an altercation. That's when Johnny pulled out a gun. The drug dealer Johnny shot died a few hours later. The brothers turned themselves in the next day. Johnny agreed to a plea deal and was charged with manslaughter. He served 10 years in prison. Eddie didn't accept the plea deal and instead faced a jury which found him guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. A change in the language of his initial sentence allowed Collins to become eligible for parole. He was released on parole after 43 years. Number 9. Otis Johnson. In 1975, 25-year-old Johnson was placed in prison for the attempted murder of a police officer. Johnson has maintained his innocence throughout his life and denies ever having committed the crime. After serving his sentence of 44 years, he was released and given his ID back and $40. He was locked up for so long that when he got out, the world around him was strange and unfamiliar as the world had made such advancements and strides, especially in the area of technology, while he was locked away all those years. In an interview, he said that upon his first visit to Times Square, he was confused by the automatons walking quickly with wires in their ears, all apparently talking to themselves. Number 8. John Franzese. John Sonny Franzese Sr. was an Italian-American mobster who was a longtime member and underboss of the Colombo crime family. Franzese's career in organized crime spanned over 8 decades. Although he was accused of murdering Genevieve's crime family hitman-turned-informant Ernest Rupolo, he was acquitted of the charges. He was later brought before a judge again in 1967, this time on bank robbery charges, and was sentenced to 50 years in prison for being the mastermind behind a series of 4 bank robberies across the country. He was paroled in 1978, but was later re-jailed at least 6 times on parole violations throughout the decades that followed. He was released in 2017 at the age of 100 years old. In total, he served 50 years in prison. Number 7. Harvey Stewart. Harvey Stewart served a total of 60 years in prison for a slew of crimes. He first entered the Texas prison system in 1951 to serve a 10-year sentence for robbing a junkyard. He was paroled 6 years later, but was thrown back in the slammer in 1958 following a murder conviction. In 1984, he was again released on parole, but was reincarcerated in 1986 on a new robbery charge. Texas officials approved Stewart's parole in April 2011, but said he would not be released until space is found for him in either a halfway house or a nursing home. In total, he served 60 years in prison. Imagine that, 60 years down this damn hole, Stewart said when he was interviewed at the Beto unit. I wouldn't recommend it. Man's gotta be a damn fool to even stick his foot in here. I'm too damn old to do any robbing, he jokingly said. I think I am anyway. My old ticker might kick out on me. Number 6. Hugh Alderman. Hugh Alderman was the sole survivor of a 4-man gang of bank robbers called the Rice Gang. He was sentenced to jail for several murders and bank robberies in 1917. He managed to escape prison not once, but twice. In 1927, he was released to a mental hospital after he was deemed mentally unstable. He died at the age of 86 after having served 62 years in prison. He was the longest-serving prisoner in the state of Florida. It's sad that he threw his whole life away for what would be the equivalent of $124,000 in today's money. Number 5. Charles Edret Ford. Ford was convicted of murder when he was just 19 years old in 1952. He spent the next 64 years behind bars. Many argued that Charles was innocent and that the only reason he was convicted was because he was a black man in the South at a time when racial prejudice was still fairly common. His defense attorney, William Renahan, argued in court, "I'm probably the oldest person in this courtroom. When Mr. Floyd went to prison, I was in the first grade. He was judged by an all-white jury. His attorney, Morris Flynn, was not a trial lawyer. He had alibi witnesses who weren't called. The two witnesses who did testify contradicted each other. The only reason they gave him a life sentence is because it was a black-on-black crime," he asserted. "If it had been black on white, he would have gotten the death penalty. This was the South. To say he had a fair trial is simply not true." Ford himself maintained his innocence, saying, "I didn't commit no such crime. I didn't kill that man. I wasn't there." He was granted a retrial in 2015, citing an unconstitutional trial and continued ineffective assistance of counsel who failed to inform him of his right to appeal. He was subsequently released to a nursing home. Unfortunately, however, not before serving most of his life behind bars. Number 4. Howard Christensen. Howard and a friend of his were sentenced to life without parole for killing and robbing a teacher while hitchhiking. The sentence was later overturned to 200 years in prison. Howard's partner in crime did not last long in prison and hung himself. Howard was a difficult prisoner and would often fight with the other inmates and also had several run-ins with visitors. After spending his prison sentence going back and forth between psych wards and regular prison, he was eventually released to a mental hospital to serve out the last few years of his sentence. He was released 2 years before his death in 2003. In total, he spent 64 years behind bars. Number 3. Richard Honeck. Richard spent 64 years and 1 month in prison to be exact. Honeck was 20 years old when he and Herman Hundhausen were arrested for the murder of Walter F. Kohler. Kohler had testified for the prosecution some years earlier, when Honeck and Hundhausen were charged with setting a number of fires in their hometown of Hermann, Missouri. He later confessed to the crime and was given life in prison. Honeck was eventually paroled from Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois in 1963, having completed 64 years and 1 month of his life sentence, and served a total of 23,418 days in jail. Number 2. Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby. Johnson served 66 years in prison for the death of James Brown. The two had been playing a game of 5-card stud poker in a saloon when a fight broke out. During the altercation, Johnson stabbed James Brown to death. Grigsby pled guilty to second-degree murder in order to escape the electric chair. Over the years, he was denied parole 33 times. He was finally released at the age of 89 as he wasn't deemed a threat to society anymore. Interestingly enough, upon his release from prison, he voluntarily returned, saying that he had a hard time finding a job and functioning day to day in the real world. He spent 2 more years in prison before finally leaving prison for good. Number 1. Paul Geidel Jr. Paul was the longest-serving prison inmate ever in the United States who lived long enough to see the day he was released. He spent a total of 68 years behind bars. In 1911, at just 17 years old, he robbed and murdered 73-year-old William H. Jackson, a wealthy broker at the hotel where he worked as a bellboy. He was subsequently convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, doctors found Geidel to be legally insane in 1926, and he was committed to a mental institution for the criminally insane. Geidel was granted parole in August 1974, but the now 80-year-old inmate did not want to leave. Having lived in prison for 63 years, his entire adult life, and having no family, he believed that he would not make it on the outside. He chose to remain in prison for almost 6 more years. He eventually left prison and lived out the remainder of his life in a Beacon, Dutchess County nursing home, before dying at the age of 93. And there you have it, 10 people who outlived insanely long prison sentences. Be sure to share, like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you never miss a video. Until next time.